Paul Kershaw studies affordability and demographics through UBC's Generation Squeeze Lab, and he's also a policy professor at UBC, and he joins me here now. Paul Kershaw, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
What are your concerns with this budget in terms of housing? Because I was asking some of the experts, is there anything new here? And I was flat out told no. How do you see it?
Well, I think the charitable way to read this budget on housing is to observe that in previous years, this federal Liberal government has taken a number of actions to try and address our housing crisis. And I would say now they've done most of the easy things. And in this current budget, they didn't step up to take on some of the more challenging issues. So, you know, we could talk in the past about the ban on foreign buyers. We talk about the flipping tax. We can talk about their accelerator fund to try to reward municipalities that resist NIMBYism to add new supply. Those are important. And yet we'll know that the massive gap between home prices and what young people and newcomers are earning is ongoing. And so the question is, will we take on the broader cultural addiction to high and rising home prices? And we didn't see in this federal government's budget in 2023 saying, we're going to build a thriving Canada that doesn't count on home prices continuing to rise. We're going to grow our GDP elsewhere. And I think in the absence of having that and saying, we want our home prices to stall indefinitely, we're not going to get any further than we are at this moment.
Right. A lot of people look at their house as a retirement fund, right? Have it grow in value. They can sell it at the end and sort of live off the money. But there's nothing new in a big way on housing here, but things they announced a year ago do come into force this year. The housing accelerator you mentioned, the first-time home buyers saving program, the banks are going to be able to start allowing people to make investments in that this year. How helpful are those going to be for people looking to get into the housing market?
Well, each of those things will be moderately helpful, but with the underlying disease of sort of a generational unfairness in our housing system is not yet being tackled. And so I think that's sort of the broader theme I would raise about this budget. Whether it is the federal budget being, a little bit nervous about saying, hey, homeowners like me and those older than me, you've been gaining a lot of wealth as home prices have been rising. And that's been causing unaffordability for those who follow you. Might we convince you to say, we don't need your home prices to continue to rise? Would you lean in with us and say, that's fine with me, I'll figure out a different way to save for my retirement?
How do you tackle that, though? How do you stop home prices from rising? Like, what is the policy solution to that?
Well, we have seen for the first time in a long time this past year a number of interest rate hikes that did actually put a dampening influence on home prices. This is probably, for the Trudeau government, the best year for home prices ever. That happened because monetary policy changed. If only Statistics Canada had been actually warning us that we had a housing inflation problem a decade ago. But they're not very good at Stats Canada about measuring housing inflation. They measure it from the standpoint of me, who's already a homeowner, and say, oh, as interest rates go down, that makes your mortgage payment more affordable. But it doesn't take into consideration who's trying to get into the housing market. And for them, as people can borrow cheaply, they bid up the price of housing, that drives up the down payments people need to save and locks them out. So they again incur as their consolation prize, rising rents.
Right, so while the interest rates drive down the price and may increase your payments, the down payment barrier is lower, and that becomes an easier hurdle to clear in some respects.
And just imagine if we didn't have 8 interest rate hikes in 1 year, but Stats Canada told us in 2005, in 2010, in 2015 that we'd been having housing inflation. Then we could have had a modest interest rate, in each of those time periods, and home prices would not be where they're at. We wouldn't have been able to borrow so cheaply and drive up the major cost in our lives. It's been good for me. I made $1 million in my home in the last 4 years.
Whoa.
It's killing people who walked behind me, who are just as smart and just as hardworking.
So, and this was the thing, when we saw the population numbers from Stats Can recently, that the population of Canada grew by over 1 million people for the first time, I looked at it and said, wow, that's great for labor, that's great for demographics, that's great for population growth. I'm like, man, they all need somewhere to live. And this is going to be a big challenge, too.
It is, but we need to take one step back and understand why are our governments increasingly keen on accelerating how many immigrants we welcome. It's partly their humanitarian reasons. It's partly because they just projected $132 billion in deficit spending this next 5 years, even though we'll never be in a recession. 85% of that deficit spending is accounted for by old age security increased spending and increased spending on medical care for our aging population. Now, we're talking about my mom here, but when my mom was starting out in the labor market, there were 7 workers for every retiree. Now there are fewer than 3. That has massive implications for government budgets. One way they're trying to hack that problem is to bring in more immigrants who, through no fault of their own, are going to need to find housing and amplify the demand for housing, which is going to give rise to unaffordability for younger people, while interestingly driving up the wealth for people like me and existing homeowners. But at the same time, we're not saying to that baby boom demographic, look, you paid taxes according to the rules of the day, but those rules turned out to be stacked against your kids and grandchildren because they didn't ask you to pay enough for old age security now. And that problem is coming home to roost.
Right, but that's a political challenge. So remember one of the big things Stephen Harper did when he was Prime Minister was try to raise the retirement age to 67, and the Liberals rolled it back to 65. And this seems to feed into this cycle that you're talking about here of increased obligations to pay to the older, less economically productive generation at the expense of helping the younger generation.
Yeah, so Prime Minister Harper, when he made that change, it was only actually going to impact the age of retirement for anyone who wasn't yet a boomer. It was only going to kick in for Gen Xers and younger. So that was a change that was going to be put on younger people. We actually said it was the appropriate change. Let's talk about that another day. The big issue right now, though, is how do you have a conversation with today's more affluent retirees and say, when no one's trying to shame you, didn't necessarily do anything wrong, just the rules of the day that happened on your watch didn't collect enough revenue to make sure that we have the healthcare system you now need and the retirement income support you're now wanting. And in the absence of that, we are using every last bit of economic growth and then some, hence we're having deficits, to try and feed into those expectations that our retired population now has, without asking them, how can you lean in and say, politicians, we don't want you to squeeze or screw over the kids and grandchildren in our lives. We need budgets that acknowledge this intergenerational tension.
So, I mean, I guess as a final point, I mean, how do you have that conversation? What do you do? I mean, you didn't see that policy solution in this budget, but there will be a budget next year, God willing. I mean, what do you want to see from Chrystia Freeland in the budget next year that starts to address this problem in a serious way?
Great question. Well, a year ago, with regards to the housing issue, we pointed out shortly after the budget came out that there was an intergenerational tension in housing. Right. And a few days later, the Deputy Prime Minister used that very language. I would now encourage her to recognize there can be no fiscal restraint that you can achieve if you don't address the intergenerational tension at the heart of your budget.
Just explain that a little bit further.
Because with the aging population, put it differently, in the mid-1990s, we knew that the baby boom was going to create problems for our Canada pension plan. Yeah. So we increased by 65% what we asked boomers to pay into their Canada pension plan premiums. We didn't do that for old age security. We didn't do it for their medical care. Because we didn't make adaptations for the latter two things, governments now need to figure out, oh my God, we didn't get them to prepay enough. It's now costing a lot. What do we do? And so that we need, there's a tension in the budget between generations there. The solution is intergenerational solidarity. How do we have a younger demographic say, we're already paying more taxes towards our aging parents and grandparents, we'll continue to do that, but can we not ask members of that affluent demographic, when they had the means, could they potentially contribute more too, so there are dollars left over to accelerate the fight against climate change, invest more to address housing unaffordability, and scale up more urgently the $10 a day childcare.
Okay. Paul Kershaw, lots to think about. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Have a great evening.